Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm your host Maz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi again. Just before we get to the next episode with Hasan Aygun, I want to remind you about the survey I have put out to get your thoughts on the podcast so far. You will find the link in the episode notes, and it will take you about 2 minutes to complete. Thank you for helping shape the future of the Voices of War. My guest today is Hasan Aygun. He's a Turkish national who has had an extensive career in international relations, global security issues, and conflict management, both as a diplomat and later as a political advisor. Hasan joined the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1983, and since then he has served abroad in various functions, including Vice-Consul, First Secretary, Head of Mission and Counsel General in a number of different countries, including Iraq, Italy, Serbia, but at that time still Yugoslavia, Austria, Azerbaijan and Saudi Arabia. He later became a senior political advisor for NATO, where over the years he provided advice to 6 different 4-star generals. During this time, he supported NATO humanitarian operations in places like Pakistan during the Kashmir earthquake and in the US during Hurricane Katrina. He also actively participated in operations in the Sudan and Somalia, as well as in counter-piracy operations and support to the African Union. Hasan also gives lectures and conferences at the African Union and United Nations events, at NATO's education facilities, and various other academic institutions. He has authored many classified papers within NATO on global security, culture, religion, ethnicity awareness, conflict resolution, and country case studies. Hasan is currently an Associate Director at Strategia Worldwide, where he advises multinational businesses, governments and NGOs on complex risk management in conflict-affected regions, with a geographical focus on the former Soviet states, the Middle East, Africa, the broader Islamic world, as well as maritime and energy transportation. And as a final point, during my preparation for this interview, I noticed on Hasan's LinkedIn profile that he also speaks 6 languages, which I find absolutely astounding. Hasan, it's an absolute pleasure to host you on the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Maz. That was impressive, hearing it from someone else.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was not easy. It was not easy. Let me put it forward first.
It's an absolutely amazing profile that you have. I was blown away when I was putting together your background. So I'm very humbled to have you on the podcast. I think you bring a particularly unique perspective across so many different dimensions of war and conflict. And maybe before we delve into that extensive background, maybe we can open with a question about how it all began. You know, what drew you into the world of foreign service and international relations all the way back in 83?
Well, first, let me thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk openly, frankly, on my past experiences and how I came to the point where I am now. Okay, I loved traveling. At the middle school, I decided that I should become a diplomat so I can travel and get paid. So that was the idea. And I started learning languages and traveling. And at one point, I found myself at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I was very enthusiastic about it. My first foreign posting was Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. And that opened my eyes. I said, hey, it's not only cocktails with a nice glass of champagne in your hand and free traveling, but there's a price to pay. Yet I loved to pay that price because it was unique. It was incredible opportunity to see the human interaction. I had to go through several wars, first the Iran-Iraq War. Then I was head of mission in Belgrade during the Bosnian War, a very, very difficult period. Then at the OSCE, I was dealing with the remnant conflicts from the breakup of Warsaw Pact from Soviet Union. As if these were not enough, then I moved to the Caucasus and saw the effects of Azerbaijan-Armenia war. And it went on like that. I don't know whether it was me that was expendable. If he dies, it's okay. If he succeeds, it's okay. I don't know, but I found myself in very, very unique domains. And that brought me to NATO. So every conflict that would come up, I had some ammunition for a few minutes to give an outline of what was happening. I think that was the difficult, precious experience I had. So it went on. It was very difficult on family. It was difficult on my two daughters who hated my job and said they would never become a diplomat. So here I am with this unique lifestyle and experience. And I don't regret much because such a job gave me lots of opportunities to understand and help people. And in fact, help my country as well to explain what was happening. Because everything depends on a good understanding of who's your friend, who's your enemy, what are their priorities, and whether you can come to a win-win situation. So that's about it. And learning languages, it is so important to understand the ordinary people. The officials, government officials, they all speak a language, but they are not telling you what they really think about, what they really believe. They are talking about government policies and they have to stay in line. So understanding local ordinary people on the street would give me an incredible dimension in understanding the fears, the expectations, the hatred, the love of people. So that's why I try to learn as many languages as I can to be able to communicate with ordinary people on the street.
Thank you so much for that kind of a broad, overarching view of your very extensive experience. Going back to that first war that you've been to, which was the Iran-Iraq war. As a young man at that point in time, I'm assuming eager, to pursue a foreign policy on behalf of, I guess, the Turkish government, right? Because you were there as a representative of the Turkish government. What was that like? Because there are multiple competing priorities. Not only are you witnessing a conflict between two neighboring nations, but you are now trying to also inject the strategic operational objectives of Turkey into this mix. What was that experience like?
Well, Iran-Iraq war was a very exceptional case in which Turkey tried to be as neutral as possible. I'm not saying impartial, neutral. Both countries were neighbors. We had long history, sometimes checkered history, but the decision was to stay outside the war. In fact, a large portion of Iraqi exports, oil exports, were going through Turkey at that time. And it was like a lifeline for Iraqis. But at the same time, the borders were open to Iran. And in fact, before going to Iraq, I was part of an operation for exchange of prisoners of war. So they would be transported to Turkey by Turkish Airlines, and we would provide them some basic support for a few hours, a couple of days, food, for example. A prisoner of war enjoying his first full meal. That was an incredible experience. Someone who has not eaten properly for months or even years, first time enjoying a full dinner. That's an experience I think everybody should experience once in their lives to appreciate normal life.
Or at least reflect on it, right? At least reflect on that. Yeah.
Yes. So in Iraq, my job was, of course, to represent my country, always think about win-win situations. That was the key. And of course, always I had to look at end state. What do I do and how it affects the relations locally or regionally or nationwide? Because it's so easy to cross the lines when everybody's sensitive about their survival. Iraqis, for many, it was a survival war. And they were much more sensitive than they would be when you talk about their leaders, decision-making, the sufferings and everything. So it was very delicate to focus on the expectations of the local people and also expectations of my own government. Balance was the key. To be trustworthy was the key. Sometimes the Turkish decision might not be appealing for the locals. The important thing was to explain them honestly what instructions I was getting and why those instructions were coming in. They would say, why can't you change it? No, it's not always possible for a bureaucrat to change them. So being trustworthy and honest were very, very important. And I think I managed to explain what Ankara was instructing me about and how I was putting it forward. Something unique about Iraq. I had 2 lunches with Saddam Hussein, one-on-one.
Wow.
He would visit Mosul, where I was posted, once a year on 8th of April. And I don't know why, but the tradition was he would have his lunch with the only diplomat existing in that city, in that area. And that was me for 2 years in a row.
Oh, wow.
So it was an incredibly unique experience to sit with Saddam Hussein around a small table and eating from the same plate and drinking from the same glass, as it is the tradition in that country. Extremely unique. He was impressive.
Maybe you can explain that tradition, because I think most people
Yes.
won't necessarily understand the meaning behind that. That's powerful.
It is a powerful tradition because they were living in tribal formations, and especially the men had to travel because they did not have any industry base. They would take their animals, go to feeding areas, or they would go to different cities, different parts of the country for trade. So everybody had to go through their neighbors or sometimes enemies' terrain. And the tradition developed that if your enemy came to your tent, to your village, you had to treat him like a guest. Outside your territory, he was an enemy. So everybody needed this kind of protection. And they had developed this protection of having anyone as guest. And one important thing was that the guest should feel safe.
Mm.
How do you feel safe? How do you know that you're not poisoned? So they had to eat from the same plate and drink from the same glass. That was the way of showing the guest that you were treating him like one of your own family or tribe. It's an incredible gesture, even valid today. And believe me, the first tries were very difficult for me. What's going on? Why don't I get my own glass? Why don't I get my own plate? But developing that understanding that it's a millennia-old tradition, I learned to survive it. But the minute I moved to my next post, I ate from my own plate and drank it.
Of course. But that's a really, really important insight into understanding the local cultures and the human terrain and how the place functions, which is definitely a principal area of my own interest. And we'll definitely come back to that. But I won't let you get away too easily to not speak about Saddam Hussein's meetings a little more because, well, for one, I've never met anyone who's had one-on-one lunches with Saddam Hussein. So that was obviously in the early days or so in the late 80s, I'm guessing. So during the Iran-Iraq war or mid-80s or?
83 to 85 to 87.
Okay, yeah. So he was still very much a favored person by the West at that point in time, right?
He was still favored, yes. And in fact, he was a ruthless, incredible man.
Hmm.
What he achieved at that time was an internal peace at a very high cost for Shia Arabs especially, but not many were dying. Only few were dying if they opposed the government. The government was ruthless. So the system was based on protecting the Sunni Arabs, which was a minority, and dividing and using Kurds against each other. So they were supporters of the regime, paid by the regime, and those opposing the regime. So Kurds had their way of getting something out of Saddam and making sure that flow of money and goods will arrive to Kurdish areas. Sometimes Sunni Arabs would not be able to find basic foodstuff, but Kurdish areas always had them because he had to appease them. And at the end of the war, the first thing he did was to attack Kurds, if you remember their history. So Saddam was very powerful in defending the Sunnis, but he was not so good in making friends with Shia Arabs. And most of the Shia Arabs were under the influence of Tehran, of course. Ayatollah Sistani was their spiritual leader, and at any occasion, they would rise against the regime. But Saddam was powerful enough to keep them under control. What happened is that the West came into Iraq with some democracy ideas against an authoritarian leader, and they made a full mess out of that country. Over 1 million people died, a few millions were displaced, and Iraq is never going to be what it was. So Saddam, he was bad. But Saddam was the lid on top of a bottle of Coke, which was shaken all the time. I can say the same for Libya, for Gaddafi.
Who I think you also had some personal engagements.
Well, I had a couple of occasions meeting him as part of a delegation. I had a late dinner on 2 occasions in his tent between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, and a tea ceremony until 5 o'clock. Again, an impressive, intelligent person. But both leaders, they never had a second man waiting in line. They were afraid of them. That's why they took too many responsibilities. And they were, in the end, killed by the weight of those mistakes they made. Sometimes it was not mistakes. Both cases, Gaddafi and Saddam, how they died was something planned outside the country.
And that's a really interesting point, because that's, and I was hoping you'd bring that point up, because I think that's one of those things that perpetually confuses me. And I think this is an important question about conflict in general, but particularly these types of conflicts over the past 2-3 decades that we've had, which many call local conflicts or civil wars. However, the more you peel back these conflicts, the more you realize that there are other players involved, right? So it is fundamentally a geopolitical conflict played out in a very localized area, because various stakeholders exist, all of whom have, whether it's overt or, covert or clandestine support by other nations. So how do you unpack that? Because at which point does a local conflict become a global conflict?
Well, every conflict attracts interested parties from inside, from outside. Every nation looks at what's happening in a specific geography where there is a conflict, whether it's going to hurt interests or whether there can be some interests in being part of that conflict or crisis, overtly or covertly, as you put. It's really difficult to tell what is international or global and not. For example, Sudan, Darfur conflict. Chad was involved, UN was involved, African Union was involved, but it was never a global or international conflict because there was almost no spillover effect. People were suffering on the ground. People were fighting and getting killed on the ground. Apart from some sympathy news about poor children, poor women, there was not much interest in getting involved. So globalization or internationalization, what a difficult word, of a conflict depends on mostly how much interested other parties are. If you have oil or other natural resources, or if you're on a hub, let's say, of transportation of goods, then it might become easily more relevant. Like the case of Iraq. Iraq had oil and Iran had oil, and they could start a spillover effect for many other countries. So sometimes excuses are made to become part of it. Iraq, as I said before, was a country ruled by an authoritarian, almost crazy dictator. Yet the reason for attacking Iraq was not a valid reason. I lived in that country, and only about 4 or 5 kilometers away from my home, there was a military installation for building some weapons. But Iraq was not capable of building weapons of mass destruction. And that, in fact, installation was built by the Polish, and the equipment came from Austria. Austrian companies and Polish companies were involved. So there was no way for West not knowing what was happening there. I knew, and I would report to my capital. I was so close. And some of those Polish engineers and Austrians became friends. So I had a very simple understanding of what was happening. And in fact, when I was at the OSCE, we were getting reports from observers who were searching for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And I met a Ukrainian colonel, and we had a frank discussion one-on-one. I said, hey, look, I lived in Iraq, and I know what they are capable of and what they are not. And what are you doing in Iraq? You've been there a year searching for weapons of mass destruction. He said, are you crazy? If I find something, I'm not going to tell. If I don't find something, I'm not going to tell that either. In my country, my salary is $300 a month. In Iraq, I'm getting $300 a day. So don't expect me to find anything.
Wow.
That was a very frank opening from an ordinary person. But at the capitals, the story was different.
Wow.
Do you believe in Washington or London? They were curious, does Iraq has weapons of mass destruction or not? But it was a good excuse to pull in the public opinion.
Mm. That's interesting because I very recently interviewed a major general from the Australian Army who was part of the observer team. So just to put the context, which period are we talking? Are we talking during the 80s or 90s, I guess, when Saddam also had
early 90s.
Early
yes,
90s,
that's
right?
90s.
Because if I remember correctly, he was one of the observers there going to destroy. And according to his recollection, they were actually destroying what he called weapons of mass destruction. Of course, Saddam didn't have nuclear weapons,
No.
never. But the way I understood the Major General explained it is that they in fact did destroy. And I'm certainly not an expert in it. I don't know what type of weapons, but it was broadly covered as weapons of mass destruction. So it'd be interesting to hear how that translates, because it's very interesting to hear you say that they couldn't have had them.
The point is, of course, almost every nation with some simple chemistry understanding come up with some chemical weapons. And in fact, Iraqis used it on Kurds once. How do we perceive those chemical weapons as an international threat? That's the point. Iraq had no interest in using it against Iranians for 9 years in a war. Iraq was not interested in attacking Washington or London with chemical weapons. They were not fully capable of. They could, of course, send a couple of agents to cause a very local damage, but they were not interested. But the West used it as an excuse to destroy the whole country. To save, I don't know how many, they were the reason for disruption of the whole society. So there is always the question mark. One can never say 100% it was innocent or not. But my personal belief in that war was there were secondary interests which were brought up. And I have to say the US failed in achieving what they were hoping to achieve in Iraq.
So did I understand you correct? I mean, you made the point about oil, that it was potentially a war about oil, or are there other interests that you're referring to?
Well, one interest was to pull the Shia Arabs on the Western interest influence zone, give them a chance to rule the country against the Sunni dictator. But my belief is that Shia Arabs had more interests than what the US can offer them. We are talking about almost 1,500 years of the feeling of belonging to a family. That's, let's say, the Shia family. And in the end, yes, the US tried very hard. They made sacrifices. So many soldiers lost their lives in that war. But now Shia Arabs are not American friends. Sunni Arabs, of course, they hate the West, they hate the Americans. And Kurds were hoping to become independent, and they have failed so far. They are de facto liberated, but never fully. They are surrounded by several friends, neighbors who are not very good friends. So it's a mess for Kurds. It's a mess for Sunni Arabs. It's a mess for Shia Arabs. So is that a win or lose situation? That the same thing can be said for Afghanistan. When the first decision to discuss pulling out of Afghanistan, I heard from a very, very important American admiral who said, you leave a war zone when you win or lose. Can anybody in this hall say that we won? Nobody said, oh, yes, we won. And what happened in Afghanistan? How many people died on both sides? How many lives were disrupted? And did we win? No. So it's very tough to say whether one is right or not. Well, if we can go back to how conflicts can become international, as I said, interests are important. History is important. Links are important. Armenia, for example, in early 90s, won a war against Azerbaijan, and they occupied 20% of Azerbaijani soil and pushed out about 1 million people as displaced people who suffered really for almost 30 years. But Russia was behind it. Religion was behind it. It was romanticized. That war was romanticized. For Orthodox Armenians fighting against Muslims. And in fact, Azeris are very secular. And when it was the time when the Russians just pulled a bit back, Azerbaijan had the opportunity to move in. And who helped them? Turks, very understandable. Israelis. They provided, the suicide UAVs. And Russians just set aside and said, unless the war goes into Armenian territory, we are not going to intervene. We just want to be part of the solution and put our troops on Azerbaijani soil after more than 30 years. And that's what happened. So is it an international crisis? Hardly. But third parties got involved easily. The same can be said for Bosnian War. I was in the middle of it for 2 years in Belgrade and then another 2 years at the OSCE. And I was part of the Dayton Agreement preparation team, traveling to the area, to Sarajevo, to Zagreb. Was it international? Apart from refugees from the area, like yourself, it was not fully international. But in fact, the international players helped extend the war beyond a short crisis. Parties got involved, they helped either side, and the war went on. And the solution, does it make everybody happy? No. Does anybody die on the ground? No. I think that's the consolence for us. So it's very difficult to judge what is global or international. But what I can say is that the effect on the ground is usually much larger if the country doesn't have the resources that attract attention from outside.
Yeah, to actually bring people in to try and resolve it.
Yes.
Your experience about Bosnia and being the chief of mission in Serbia during that war, or at that time still Yugoslavia, I guess, is obviously immensely of interest to me. So maybe we can actually focus on that since you brought it up, because I think that's a particularly interesting conflict that did have a number of international players within it. But I think your situation would have been rather unique sitting in Serbia as a Turkish diplomat. And for anybody who knows anything about Bosnian history, and particularly kind of even the post-war relationships with Turkey, Turkey's kind of viewed almost as the Muslim side of Bosnia, the Bosniak protectorate in many ways. Whereas, of course, Serbia and Russia are the protectorates, so to speak, of the Serb population in Bosnia, and of course, Croatia moving on to Austria, Germany as the pseudo-protectorates for the Croatian population in Bosnia. How was that for you being a Turk in Belgrade during this war?
Well, I was an enemy for the leadership, and they made me pay for my stay in Belgrade. One of the first things they did was I found a house in Dedinje, which was diplomatic area. The first thing they did was to empty a villa next to mine and put Arkan's men in that villa. Željko Raznjatović Arkan. There were maybe 15, 20 of them living in that house, singing their historical war songs, occasionally shooting in the air or at my satellite dish.
Huh.
And when it became, I had 2 young daughters, they made sure not to do anything physical. I think they were under really strict instructions not to cause too much trouble, but enough to disturb me. And
to make you know that they're there.
Yes. I could not get a phone to my house for almost a year. So we brought wireless systems from Turkey to be able to communicate with the embassy. So I suffered the animosity of the leadership, but it was professional. They once hit my official car, a truck coming by purposefully hit our car. And they made the same accident against my military attaché, colonel. His car was totally destroyed. So these are the physical activities. But morally, I had to make a distinction between ordinary people and the authorities. And I could, that made me survive the period in Belgrade without hating everybody, because ordinary Serbs were also suffering. And I had a chance to help Bosnians who were traveling, who were reaching, let's say, Serbia. We had the system of transporting them to Turkey, and the Serbian authorities were happy about it. It was some sort of ethnic cleansing. Serbs were happy to get rid of Bosnians, but for us, it was a life or really difficult life choice and we provided help. In fact, during that period, we managed to take out about 30,000 people.
Wow.
And the most interesting case was Trebinje, for example. When Muslims were expelled from Trebinje. There were cases of mixed families, how they suffered, or how they became overly nationalist. A Bosniak wife would be thrown out of the family, or a Serbian husband would suffer the same fate occasionally. I tried focusing on the ordinary people, the innocent people, and I also tried to focus on stories of different ethnicities helping each other at extreme cases. I think there are a few stories very interesting to hear.
I would love to hear them, yeah.
If you have the time. For example, Trebinje. The Trebinje case, when they expelled about 6,000 Bosniaks out of that town, some of them made it to Montenegro. And we had a very good cooperation with Montenegrin authorities. They did not support the militia. They, in fact, blocked the militia. And we managed to get about 700 of Bosniaks by air, by flights to Montenegro. But some of them were reaching Belgrade, and we were providing them shelter, food, and transportation to Turkey. So one day I was told that there was an elderly man and woman who wanted to talk to me personally. I said, okay, send them in. They did not want translator. So we communicated in Pidgin, German, Serbian. And the man was a professor in his early 70s, and the lady was his sister. And it took them about 8 to 9 days to reach Belgrade. If you remember, there was no transportation, so they made it to Belgrade. I said,
they walked. Did they? Is that?
They walked. They found some local support going through Sanjak area. So they made it in the end. They said, I said, we are going to help you. They said, no, that's not the point. Thank you for your help. Okay, we'll take it. But the night before the attack, our neighbor, Serbian neighbor, came to us. And he told us about the attack. And we had some savings. And it was about 60,000 German marks. So we gave our money to our neighbor, who will bring it to you, so you can send it to us. My first reaction was, okay. In that wartime, when pensions were about 25, 30 German marks, whether this man will make it or not, I don't know. I said, okay. I said, I make sure to know where you're going to be. And we, in fact, put them on a bus, provided them with documentation and everything, and sent them to the Turkish border, where there was a refugee camp in Gazi Osman Pasha. A couple of days later, I was told that there was a Serbian man, a very nervous man, sweating at the door, who wanted to meet the chief of mission. I said, okay, send him in. So this man came. He was in a terrible shape, smelling, not washed, and I don't know how he made it. So he started taking his clothes off. From every part you can imagine, money was coming out. So he put 59,920 German marks on the table. We counted it. And he said he had to take 80 German marks. He didn't have his own money for the trip. Wow. And he started crying. And I said, okay, thank you. I'll make sure that they get the full amount, 60,000. We had funds.
Yeah.
And I wanted to give him 500 German marks. He said, no, I cannot take it. Because the minute I walk out of your embassy, I will get arrested. I went in your embassy and I did not have a passport to ask for a visa. So I'm going to be questioned. And if they find money on me, you know what's going to happen.
Of course, yeah.
So we gave him some dinars, something like 100 German marks worth of dinars. And he went out. I asked my people to keep an eye. A few hundred meters later, two men got into his arms, put him in a car. And I did not hear from him until 2013.
Oh, wow.
In 2013, I had his details. So we sent the money to that man and his sister. They bought a small apartment in Bursa, and they lived there until 2005 and 2008. I followed their story. So in 2013, I was in Dubrovnik for a NATO event, and I went to Trebinje, and I found the address. He was working in the garden. And I had a suit and a tie, so out of ordinary person. He looked at me, I looked at him. I think we stared at each other for some time. Wow. I was trying to figure out whether he was he.
Yeah.
And he said, "You were in Belgrade." I said, "Yes, I was in Belgrade." And then we had some coffee and a long discussion. He went back to his departure from the embassy. He was beaten up for 3-4 days, kept in a cell for another week. And in the end, they thought he was not worthy of anything. So he was thrown out. And he made his way back and lived as a defeated but proud person. So there are so many stories like that. Similar things happened the other way around as well. So the understanding is that ordinary people, some of them, of course, listened to the official rhetoric because they wanted to believe in something. And in Belgrade, many people had no money to buy newspapers, so they were renting it by the hour. And they wanted to believe the official rhetoric. Oh, we are defending ourselves. While defending ourselves, we entered this town, that town. In Banja Luka, we saved ourselves freedom. Yes, we destroyed 15 mosques in Banja Luka, but that's normal. This is defense against aggressors. So ordinary people really wanted to believe the government. And that brings us to how rhetoric, how narrative of the governments or war perpetrators affect the people. But of course, lies can only last for some time. And the same happened in Serbia. And Milosevic, the proud Serbian nationalist, were easily handed over to international authorities. Yes, few people cried after him, few people made noise, but the majority had the moral understanding that what happened was bad. And Serbia is still a defeated country of people who are shy to discuss history. Many of them were not part of it, the younger generation, but they still feel some sort of remorse about what happened. And I think it's true for many wars. You can never come out morally 100% pure.
Absolutely. Especially in a war like that where, and maybe that's another question that I'd like to hear your opinion on. First part of the question, I guess, is how does that happen? How do neighbors, so this is a really positive example, and I think we need to emphasize those, and thank you for that. They gave me goosebumps, by the way. That was a really powerful example. But what we see more often is that, or hear more often about, is the neighbor turning on neighbor, which is how these wars are sustained, right? So firstly, how does that actually happen? And then the next part of it is, how do the narratives that you mentioned and the rhetoric that goes around the war help keep that war alive, I guess?
Of course, personalities play an important role, but pack understanding. If you're part of a big group, then you can easily put aside your strong moral values for sake of belonging to one party or the other. And that was the feeling. Everybody were doing it, so I joined them. Even in football games, the same thing happens. Sometimes you're part of a supporter of a team, and you go into a brawl, and you do something which you would not do when you're alone, when you're in your true senses. So this pack identity, I think, has a certain effect. Interests, if it is a survival issue, and if there is no punishment that is visible, that plays a certain role. The person may feel guilty inside, but outside he is innocent. So people lose that balance. If, for example, during the war, your neighbor left and the car is there, so what prevents you from taking it? And many people did that. The example I gave was an extreme case, but it's worth hearing that there is good in every nation, every tribe, every clan, every neighborhood. But the opposite was very valid as well. Think of Srebrenica.
Yeah.
I was awake all night and I was getting minute by minute reports of what was happening. Do you believe every person who killed an innocent Muslim was really a normally bad guy? No, but some of them joined the crowd and said, okay, this is a matter of survival, so we killed them. I'm sure many of them still feel guilty inside if they're still alive. But yet some of them said, okay, it was us against them, and there are no rules. Machiavelli. We win at any cost, and then we will feel guilty about it later. So that's the feeling. And the narrative, of course, encourages people to do things out of ordinary. You respect your neighbor when everything is normal. But if there is an encouragement from the people you want to believe, and there is encouragement from the neighbors, friends, family around you, then you may go out of line. And maybe 80-90% of the Serbs did the same. But many really wanted to believe. A small example, in early March in Belgrade, just after the really severe cold, I saw an old, very fragile lady selling some flowers, tiny flowers. And she was shivering. I said, okay, how much it is? For the whole bunch, she asked for something like $2 in today's exchange. And I gave her maybe $10 or more. And I took everything and I said, go back home today. And she said, where are you from? I said, I am Turkish. She had tears in her eyes and she said, why are you doing this to us? I said, what? The war. Why are you fighting us? Why are you bringing all this calamity on us? And she was sincere. She was sincere. She was made to believe, and she wanted to believe that Turks, Germans, Americans, and Bosniaks were bad, and everybody else on their side was good. So this is how narratives bring ordinary people to do things out of ordinary.
It's incredible, and it's incredibly powerful. I mean, another guest that I had on previously, a philosopher, Keno Driscoll, he's done research into, and it was funny you talked about the Iraq War, because he's researched power of narrative as one of the domains in how the Bush and Blair administrations motivated their population to go to war. And it was this, and it's a very famous idea. It's nothing new, but, particularly kind of George Bush with the whole axis of evil, you're either with us or you're against us. It infuses within the sentence, the words, the language, moral righteousness, a moral judgment that, we are fighting evil, therefore we are good. And it's a hugely powerful motivating tool to drive and encourage and unite people, like you said, because of a sense of belonging, because of a sense of group identity. And when an identity is under threat, it becomes stronger, it becomes more galvanized, and therefore this kind of existential threat, like you beautifully summed up about, either you live or you die, and it's my group that's going to protect me, which I find a hugely, hugely powerful topic that we very rarely discuss on and analyze on the broader conflict dynamics. We seem to focus on particular actions, of bombs fell here, bombs fell there, and we kind of try to dissect it on a day-to-day basis, but very rarely really peel back the multiple layers of a conflict that actually keep it alive. And this is one of them, right?
True. For the US and UK case, it was easy for people to believe because they were not feeling the war at their surroundings. It was a distant war. So many people wanted to believe their leaders, or they're evil. But what happened, the same applied for Vietnam. When the veterans and when body bags started coming back, people started questioning whether the rhetoric was correct or not. And in the end, US, after losing 55,000 people, had to flee the country through the roof of the embassy. And Vietnam is a normal country today. So why more than 1 million people died, gassed, shot in the head? So public opinions react late, unless, of course, they have to sacrifice themselves. The same applies for Afghanistan. The same applies for Iraq and many other wars that's far away from your home country. For the American or British public opinion, all they heard was Blair or Bush. They never heard what the ordinary Iraqis were going through. And I had met so many people in Iraq, Shia, Sunni, or Turkoman, or Kurds. How they suffered tells me another story. Perhaps I was too much involved in the plight of ordinary people in those countries, behind the fronts, what was happening to the ordinary people. So I was very skeptical of the war on Iraq. I would repeat, Saddam was not a good guy. He was ruthless, a dictator. But is Iraq better today? Is Libya better today? We start solutions. We never finish them as West in most cases. Afghanistan, we started something. And in fact, in Afghanistan, the fight was against Osama bin Laden and maybe 800 followers of him. Then it turned into Taliban, which was maybe 6-7 million. Then it turned into a fight against the Pashtun, who are 45 millions and living in 3 different countries. So to be aware of the culture, ethnicity, history of where we are going is extremely important. And that was one of the points you put in front of me. How do we succeed in solving a conflict? And your question was about war. Is war a relevant tool? It is. But at the same time, wars have solved so few problems, or they created new ones.
No, absolutely, and I think I definitely will come on that for the understanding of the local context. I think it's hugely important. Just before we move away too far from Iraq and your experiences there, because I want to come back to a point that you brought up really early on, and that was because I think it's relevant here, because it speaks to another area of interest. And that's, you mentioned about your Ukrainian friend who was earning $300 a month in Ukraine, but was earning $300 a day in Iraq during the inspections. I went to Iraq as a civilian, as a contractor, heading up a British development consultancy. We had really interesting projects, decentralization of governance, building civil society through social media, even involved in some various security apparatus projects. But I was amazed, and we often talk about the military industrial complex, but I was amazed by the post-conflict industrial complex, where that very point you made, $300 a day. Today, that is $1,500 a day for contractors who are flying in from all around the world. And literally, I was setting up a very small company, but we were paying £1 million a month for various projects. Maybe 50 to 100,000 of that might go towards the actual delivery of the project, but the rest would be for our own security, because we had to have our armored vehicles, we had to have stay in highly secure hotels. And of course, all of these hotels were charging exuberant fees. We would then fly in various consultants from, far-flung places around the world who were experts in various dimensions. But 90% of those that I spoke with were largely cynical. They knew that they would be in Iraq for the next year. Then they'll go to Afghanistan. Then they'll go to Syria. Then they'll maybe fly across to another part of the world and maybe go to Venezuela or, end up somewhere else because that is their life and that is their job. But most of them were really cynical about the likely impact they would have on quote unquote fixing Iraq. And that opened my eyes in many ways, because I realized this is a monstrous, hundreds of millions of dollars industry that's being poured into places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But most of the people doing the work don't necessarily believe that it's going to fix anything. How does that viewed through your eyes?
I totally agree with you. And in Iraq, I did not see the part of post-crisis rehab. But in Somalia, I did. I was responsible for relations with the African Union during the operation counter-piracy. And it started with that, but with Darfur. So I became part of or so-called an ambassador of NATO at the African Union. And we had contacts with the Somali leadership of that time. This is exactly what they told to me, what you said. There are organizations, UN, for example, helping the Somalis from Kenya. They come to Kenya. Nobody wants to come to Mogadishu. Okay, it was not very easy, but they would stay in Kenya, earn $15,000 a month or more, and they gave me similar figures. Nations talk about $100 million aid, and maybe if we are lucky, 20 million comes here, and 80 million goes back to contractors, or there are conditions that the material needed should come from the aid providing country. And the prices are fixed by the provider, not by the buyer. That's very unfortunate. I think it has become an industry for nations. Many nations ask the question, what is in it for me? Even countries like Norway, which is one of the biggest aid donors, they ask the question, okay, we go into this country. I've seen it in Ethiopia, for example. We go in, but what do we get out of it? We go in, we help them, then they're ready to make business, and they make business with the Chinese or the Americans that are more powerful nations, let's say. It's a dilemma. I don't think there is an easy solution to it. Even if you provide the aid to some local authorities, it's a matter of ethics for those local authorities to make sure that people benefit. And in Africa, I am not exactly sure about the aid programs of the UN, but it must be over $800 billion in the history of the organization, maybe more. This is a very old figure I remember. How much of it made to ordinary people? That's the question mark. And in fact, funny enough, that's why the Chinese have been so effective in Africa. They give some money to the leaders, certainly, but they also build railroads, ports, industrial sites. They use their own workers. They use their own material. But in the end, something remains in the hands of those countries. Whereas the West, when they go in, they hardly make such an impact. In Ethiopia, I think the first paved road between two cities was built by the Japanese. And they may regret it because they didn't get much out of that country. That's the Chinese and the Turks. They are very active in that country. The Dutch, they produce their tulips in Ethiopia. So most of the donors expect to get something out of it. They don't really mind whether the aid goes to the right people or not. I have a personal experience in that case in Azerbaijan, when I was Consul General there. It's Turkish foundations were offering aid to local people. And I said, my first reaction was that, okay, it shouldn't be money because we need to give something to people which they cannot sell easily. So food stuff. And we are not going to give it through the local authorities because the first month I got there, I saw Turkish food stuff sold in the market with the stamp that it was aid coming from a certain foundation. So we started distributing it directly to people. About 1,200 families were in our list, and we decided to deliver them directly. The local authorities were not very happy for an obvious reason. And first, the local people suspected us. I said, are you serious? Are you giving us 5 kilos of meat and 20 kilos of cereals or whatever? Said, yes. They said, what is in it for you? Come on.
Yeah.
I would funnily put my salary into picture occasionally, because that was the understanding for people. When they would say, what is in it? The local, let's say, bureaucrat was earning on average 50 American dollars at that time. Today, it's a different story.
Yeah.
I would say for $50, your bureaucrats can risk their jobs. But for my salary, I'm not going to risk my job for 2 kilos of meat or anything.
Yeah.
They would say, okay, that's understandable. You get so much? I would say, yes, I get so much.
Yeah.
I hope you will get the same in the future. And that's what happened in that country. But at that time, when the incentives were low for bureaucrats or local authorities, and when the incentives are low for foreign aid donors, the aid doesn't reach the people who really need it.
Yeah. And I think, again, the Balkans are a prime example of that. From the war onwards, it's very much about individual survival. And also for those in power, they don't know arguably how long they will be in power for. So therefore, they take what they can while they can to secure their safety, security for the future. And if you get a moment of power, if you get a position of power, your principal goal is to get as much as you can while you are in power, because it's a very short-lived point. But that also reminds me, there's one I would be chastised by certainly many of the Bosnians who listen to my podcast if I didn't ask about the Dayton Peace Accords. You mentioned you were part of the Dayton Peace Accords negotiations. What role did you play? Because I think you have, again, another really interesting story. And forgive me, I'm conscious of the time. Are we still okay for time?
I am definitely okay. I'm on holiday, let's say.
Okay. Yeah. So what was your role on Dayton?
There is always a major dilemma in bringing peace or stopping the fighting versus full solution to the problem. And coming to Bosnia, For example, let's talk about Cyprus. In 1974, UN moved in, and no one got killed after that. But the two parties became too lazy to find a real solution. Look at UNRWA, the Palestinian case. Can outside brought partial solutions, stopping the fighting, is an incentive for a final solution or not? Dayton Agreement was a temporary solution. The idea was to stop killings, to stop the plight of ordinary people, sufferings. But it was never designed to become a permanent solution. And that's where everybody failed. Once everybody was relaxed, okay, nobody's dying. So do we really need just solution? And the West did not impose anything further than Dayton Agreement on the parties. The three republics, the rotating presidential solutions, decision making. I think it's a total failure on part of the West to bring solutions to the crisis that is still on the ground. So many Bosnians have left their country with no intention to go back. Who remained? Mostly are those who could not go out. They did not have the skills, they did not have the language. So the best and brightest, in most cases, left the country. That's a big dilemma. Whether outsiders, by stopping a fighting, have the will or power to bring a final solution. Of course, final solution, I'm always trying to talk about a win-win situation when nobody feels totally defeated. The same goes for Bosnia, whether Serbs or Croats or Bosnians feel that they have been treated justly. And I traveled to Bosnia because Bosnian NATO operation and Kosovo operations were under our headquarters. So I had to travel once a month to Sarajevo and to talk to people and to meet, of course, the NATO force leadership there. There was no strong incentive on part of the local authorities for a serious solution. As you said, everybody was interested in defending the interests of their respective people and not interested in coming together and bringing, for example, Bosnia into the European Union. And it's sad, it's really sad, if three leaderships in that country have an IQ of, I would say, 101. They would go for a united picture and bring the European Union in. Is it a magical wand to cure all the problems? No. But it will definitely be better than what it is today. The same goes for Cyprus. If the local leaders could unite, okay, one party is part of European Union, but they have no access to the rest of the country. So it will remain divided until both parties are part of the same family. And in Bosnia, it's Bosnia-Herzegovina, but it's not one single family. Okay, peaceful coexistence. I think that's what they should concentrate on. We are here. We don't have to mingle. We can be in our separate parts, but we should have one goal, to have a better life. And unfortunately, that's not happening in most of the cases. When a solution like Dayton Agreement was imposed from outside without incentives to push hard really the people or to persuade. I don't think it should be pushing hard. It should be persuading the people to go for the common good of the whole society. And you are never further away than 50 kilometers from Serbs or Croats in Bosnia. The same applies for everybody. It is such a mosaic of different beliefs in one small area.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And while we were there, we also noticed, and we happened to have been there during the 2014 riots where the presidential palace was burnt. And, there was the people felt like, well, at least we were naive enough to think, hold on, something's happening. There's an uprising by people. And we were literally standing and watching the presidential palace being burnt. We were 20 meters, 30 meters away from, these riots amongst a crowd of people who were basically just onlookers. And there's, of course, the rioting crowd doing the rioting, so to speak. But then you turned around and 100 meters down the road, the cafes were still open. People were still having their coffee. Life went on as normal. And when we then spoke to some of those people who just sat there and watched, it became obvious that people have almost lost hope in change. The general rhetoric was, it's just another riot. Within 2 days, it will be politicized. Within 2 days, the different parties will start blaming each other, and the actual momentum of the people will die out because it will be politicized and turned into ethnic, the Serbs will say, it's the Bosniaks. The Bosniaks say it was the Serbs, and the Croats will say it was both of the other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore people have kind of, they're just almost indifferent about what happens, because there's just and they use the term quite often in Bosnia, and I'm sure you've heard it, the octopus. The octopus is so big and wide with the tentacles are everywhere. Yeah. That, it is just too difficult. You cut one tentacle off, there are, plenty others. And I think that speaks to that very point. It's the narratives are still there. They're powerful. The interests are still there. They're powerful. The system is so complex by design because it was trying to solve a problem, but it is in no individual party's interest to resolve Dayton. And everybody in Bosnia knows that Bosnia can't go forward until Dayton is resolved, until we get rid of Dayton, whatever that means, because, it is a stifling system. But Dayton can't be resolved because none of the parties want to resolve it, because it's in their interest to keep their power base, by keeping the quote unquote, keeping the war alive, or the narrative of the war alive, which I think is, the point you're making about most of these types of conflicts. What do we do? What does the international community do? Because I think the international community, what can we do? Otherwise, this is going to go on forever, really.
I think the interest in the international community to solve such problems is rather low. The UN, for example, it's an interesting structure. It can only intervene if everybody agrees, and everybody would agree on the minimum common standard. And in most cases, the standard is not there. The interests are low. If you're a UN mission soldier coming from Fiji or from Nigeria, your interests are not fully on behalf of the local people, but different interests. And you have a limited time and you're looking forward. The same goes for capitals. The same goes for UN headquarters. The interests to find real honest solutions is very low, unfortunately. I saw that, and the organization's structures, the manning is not always the best. In the African Union, for example, I can say more than 50% of the staff were there because they knew the right people back at home. So there are many problems related to it. The magic is a generation who has not gone through the hardships of crisis. And Bosnian Serbs and Croats at least share the same language and I can say the culture. So the younger generation, once the leaders of the past have passed their age of leading, maybe the younger generations will have a hope. But this is not true for many other societies. If I go back to Cyprus, for example, since 1974, the Greeks are not learning Turkish. Turks are not learning Greek. So the common language will be probably English between the two communities of the same island. This goes for the Caucasus. When I served in Georgia, the initial reaction of the Georgians was to stop teaching Russian at their schools. But after a couple of years, they realized that they did not have a lingua franca with their neighbors, Turks, Azeris, Armenians, Russians. So they reintroduced Russian language to a number of schools to keep a number of people who can understand their neighbors. But in many cases, the last train is gone, and the two communities that have to live together cannot find a common ground. So I still have a hope for Bosnia that the younger people will question, why are we fighting? Of course, the stories, the legends will continue. They're bad, we are good. But after some time, maybe interests of younger generations will prevail and they can come to a point. This is very wishful thinking. I'm playing Pollyanna, but there is a slight hope and chance that society may find a common way to live on the same territory. Yes, distinct, but if they can find a common good, there is still hope. But I don't trust on international organizations bringing a solution. We had cases in NATO, for example, when Georgia and Ukraine were attacked. The initial reaction was, do we do something about it? These are partnership for peace countries, and they are under an obvious attack. In fact, this was the initial reaction of the military in NATO. In both cases, we prepared our scenarios. It's called prudent thinking because we were not allowed to make plans. So it was never called a plan. It was called prudent thinking. But in Georgia case, when we were going through that prudent thinking, how do we provide help without kinetic? It's, let's say, non-kinetic, but show that you're there. The first reaction was for Barroso, Sarkozy, and Merkel to travel to Moscow and stop NATO. No, we have interests. The Germans, we need gas. We need gas from Russia. We cannot even think about opposing, forget about fighting. And that encouraged Putin to go into Ukraine. What happened? Some paltry sanctions, but gas pipelines are being built and business as usual goes on. I think Germans sell more Mercedes in Russia than in many other countries. So interests. And as I said, international organizations, including NATO, is the point of minimum common values and standards. So don't expect much from international organizations. I worked in two of them. I was involved with the UN and African Union, and I'm slightly pessimist, or more than slightly pessimist about really doing something. The only case an international organization would be effective is real defense. During the Warsaw Pact, NATO times, any attack would have been responded with force. But when it was the Brits fighting the Argentinians over Falklands, you know what NATO did first? They put a geographical line for areas to be considered as defense of member nations. And they made sure that Falklands or Southern Rim was out of NATO's defense geography.
Wow.
The same applied for NATO operation in Iraq and NATO operation in Afghanistan. Are we really there to defend NATO values, NATO countries? Okay, we'll do something out of course, being part of the same organization. Yes, certain things were considered, but never fully enthusiastic about fighting the problem and winning. So Turks, for example, in Afghanistan, they did not want to be involved in kinetic fighting. They were busy for some projects. They provided support for future intended post-crisis rehab projects, but they never got involved in the fighting. So a few nations carried the burden of fighting, and they lost.
This is, I can't agree more. I think this is a real perspective on the geopolitical machinations that exist, which I find fascinating that most people say, oh, of course, what do you think that we're actually going to war to help? But most people then start still, quote unquote, swallowing the official story, and we still end up going ultimately to no solution, which I find absolutely fascinating. What keeps you going then? Because I agree. I think I'm becoming, and I'm young, and I'm young in this game, and I'm perhaps still naive, and I still have I'm perhaps still a little bit idealistic, but I think I'm a realist enough to agree with everything you're saying. But what keeps you going?
I think I gave up on solving the problems to the point that there would be no conflict, no problem. I gave up on that a long time. So instead of a sense of community, I concentrate on what I can do personally. In the case of, for example, crisis areas, I try to put my perspective, present it to interested parties, and then hope that something will happen. If I'm asked, that's what I do. In fact, with our company's strategy worldwide, we can make a small impact on certain cases. If a company applies us for help, they are going to invest in a specific nation where there are certain risks. The first issue is to identify the risks and to mitigate if agreed upon. The idea is always to bring in win-win situation. The local people be happy, the local authority, the company should be happy. And this is true for everything else. I do geopolitical analysis for a group of companies. The same. What are the risks? I just finished yesterday a 16-page narrative on Eastern Mediterranean. What are the problems? I'm talking about Turkey, Syria, Israel, Egypt, Libya, Cyprus, and Greece.
There are problems there?
No, who said that? Who said
wow,
that?
What an easy area to analyze. Wow, okay.
Very, very easy area. So I wrote down 16 pages of problems and possible solutions. On paper, it looks great. I can solve any problem on paper. When it comes to realities, it is difficult. But at least our task is to put solutions, if we can, down on paper, so that there will be a record of it in the future. For example, Turkish-Israeli relations. It was great. It was great. Turkey was one of the first Muslim country to recognize Israel. And we had a history of 15th century, 16th century Jews being expelled from Iberian Peninsula, coming to the Ottoman soil. They were called Milleti Sıdıka, that means loyal people. Jews were called loyal people. And in Israel, about 100,000 Jews have dual passports.
Huh.
So as two non-Arab nations of the area, do we have anything to fight over? No. Should we have moral values about the oppressed and oppressors? Yes. Can we help the oppressed through hard rhetoric or soft power? My belief is the second one, soft power. Try to persuade, help your friends to solve their problems. So there are very optimistic solutions. It is just very difficult to put all the elements into the same basket. Like Netanyahu today wants fight. Today, Turkish president is happy with certain crisis. So that keeps the public attention away from other problems. Economy, for example, for Turkey, or lack of human rights, rule of law. There are so many objections in Turkey. But if there is an outside threat, that's great. That's lovely. Everybody unites against the outside threat. And unfortunately, many leaders have used it so far, and they will continue to use it. So that's my point. At least I have the power to put what is right for me on paper. 99% goes unnoticed or say, okay, it's all right. But at NATO, I always had the feeling that I was giving the right advice. The commanders would agree with me face to face. I don't know what was happening behind the closed doors because they had other incentives or orders from their capitals. But the way I was paid, I said, okay, why would they bother paying me if what I told them was not what they expected or what they enjoyed hearing? My first commander said something very important. It was his first phrase. He said, you have to be brutally honest with me. Even if you don't agree with me, you have to tell me that you don't agree with me. I don't need someone agreeing with me all the time. That means I'm right, and who needs advice if you're always right? So that was the motto, and I think I have to put forward what I believe is right. Whether it makes an impact or not, that's a big question mark.
Oh, I have no doubt, and this allows me also to pivot to perhaps, and again, conscious of the time, maybe the last area I'd like to focus on, and that is, as a political advisor or as a chief political advisor to senior NATO commanders, if I understand it correctly, one of your jobs was to analyze the social, political, economic situation, or the, as we would potentially call that, the human terrain. And I often refer to it as the ecosystem that exists within an area of conflict. And this is certainly an area that's very close to my heart. I'm involved in a couple of courses where we're trying to teach or trying to peel back some of these layers to try and analyze the architecture that exists within a conflict. And you've made a couple of points throughout our conversation about the importance of understanding what happens, the historical context that keep, just when you're talking about the relationship between Israel and Turkey, you brought up a couple of interesting points that are so fundamental to understanding how the relationships today exist between those two nations. To what extent do you think we invest sufficient time and resources in understanding the quote unquote ecosystem of a conflict before we say send troops in or, send aid in or send, put sanctions or whatever it might be?
I think it's extremely important. It's 50% of success, at least 50% of success in any conflict or in any tension situation to understand your rivals. I think that's one of the most important points of the American case. They usually have difficulty in understanding the opponents. And this is true for many other nations. You have to understand the culture aspect, historical background, what makes two nations kick in as friends or foes, social structures, ethnic and religious. You cannot change ethnic, religious, cultural, and historical backgrounds. they stay more or less the same. If you understand them, then you may have a chance to build a bridge, fill the gaps between the two societies. Political, on the other hand, depends on many more aspects. Survival of the politician, survival of the party, keeping the public opinion under context, information management, strategic communication, they all kick in. So in most cases, political aspect, political dimension is the most difficult one. During my lectures at Steadfast, Pinnacle, and Pyramid, this is NATO high-level course for preparing commanders into NATO structure. My discussion was always based on the military. You get an order, you get the means, and you have only one thing to do, win the war or not get defeated. But for the politician is a belly dancer. They have to keep the public interest. They have to think about the economy, how my party is doing, what are the polls telling me? And they may change their orders, not based on what's happening on the ground, kinetically, but on what's happening in the background. So awareness, as I said, is 50%. And awareness of the public opinion is more difficult to achieve. Because one of the first things that, for example, in Serbia, in Belgrade, was to control the awareness. So people should not know what's happening. People should only hear what the leaders are telling them. In today's social media environment, things are changing slightly, but it is so manipulative. It's so difficult to stop lies or stop exaggerations. I still believe that, at least on the professional side, the leaders should listen to people who know the adversary. And people who know their own people as well, of course. It's not a one-way street. Unless scorched earth, total annihilation is possible, resistance will always come. I love a phrase the Afghans used in fighting against the West. They said, you have the weapons, we have the time. And they had the time. Because every soldier who went there was immediately thinking about when they are going to leave and their loved ones at home, their normal lives. So awareness is a key. And there are so many cases why wars will get out of hand because you don't know your adversary or counterpart.
Have you seen it?
One.
Yes, sorry, go on.
Yes. For example, gender issues. Now, we had touched it briefly. Gender is an extremely important issue to understand the dynamics of different genders in different societies. Afghanistan was an important case. For example, Americans wanted to treat Afghans as fellow Americans, male-female interaction, until a Swedish gender advisor joined the cadre of Secure Supreme Allied Commander Europe to advise him, hey, don't do it. They may understand it differently. So that's part of a solution now, to understand how the adversary, the local people, will see what you are doing, will react to what you are doing. If you pat a child on the head in Thailand, that's an offense. If you do it in Turkey, that's a compliment. Oh, you like my child. So it's a matter of totally understanding where you are and what you are doing. In Saudi Arabia, I was at Jeddah Airport VIP. And I saw this local person, important person at the VIP, eating food and also treating his nose in a way you know.
Yeah.
And I gave him a look which was not the correct thing to do. A bit of frowning. He said, what is wrong? I'm using my left hand.
Yeah.
I'm using my right hand for the food. So what is wrong? Okay, that was wrong of me to judge him for what he did from my perspective, but that was normal for his perspective. So unless you understand them correctly, you're going to frown at what they're doing. Of course, it was disgusting. So.
Yeah, but it's a really great example because it's a small example of an everyday interaction,
yes.
but it has the ability to ultimately destroy potentially a relationship because it is something that we would consider just really inappropriate, and therefore we would cast. We have the tendency to brush that person with a certain color the moment we see it, right? And you make a very good point. And there are so many elements like that. And you bring up gender as an example, which many soldiers on the ground would not have been told, certainly in the initial days, what the rules and regulations might be or how something might be taken out of context, and it could drive and contribute to people turning against your own soldiers, for example. It's absolutely.
And there are many cases in Afghanistan or in Iraq, in different societies, that misunderstanding or not understanding the local people, and even if we don't appreciate, we have to accept it as it is, which is tough. But for Saudis, left hand is doing the dirty work. So they never shake your left hand unless you don't have a right hand. That's their understanding, and that's something normal. For us, it can be offensive, but then you have to either keep your ways to yourself and make sure that he doesn't touch anything that belongs to his left hand, and they're careful about it. But then that's the way things are. We cannot make everybody appreciate our values. That's one of the major problems with the West. Democratization of societies, for example. Are they really ready for democracy? Will democracy solve their problems? Ultimately, yes. But what if they are not ready for it? Look at African countries. How many of them are democracies? Do you know how many African nations changed leadership peacefully through elections? Less than 10%. Less than 10% of leaders are changed through fair elections by the will of the people. So if you are part of that society, will you believe in elections? Will you believe that democracy brought the right leaders? Why a 30-year-old sergeant may lead a country for 30 years? Millions of people. Do they really understand and believe that they have the right chemistry for that? Let's look at back to Bosnia, the three leaders that come from their societies. Are they really the best? Or are they in there to appease certain groups? That's a big question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe the last question. Many analysts are warning us now of ever greater and greater risk of major state-on-state conflict because there are so many tensions around the world with a number of authoritarian leaders in various powerful countries who are all fighting for their power base and for their influence, whether globally or regionally. What's your view? How worried are you about the future in a major state-on-state conflict?
My belief is that we have passed beyond the point of state-on-state wars, particularly the major ones, greater powers. In the US, in Washington, in different environments I'm part of, I hear always about, China is the biggest threat, or the Russians are touching our interests. So we should keep on building fifth generation, sixth generation air fighters and this and that. At the same time, for example, for the US, China, how much investment the Americans have in China? More than $1 trillion, 2 trillions. How many General Motors cars are produced in China and the US? China has the higher number. What is Chinese imports Americans are taking in? During the pandemic, the lines of transportation communication were disrupted, and Americans had a great shortage of parts. 20% of all components of electronics or, let's say, computer science, 20% is manufactured in China. Get them out. Is it easy to replace them? No. So my feeling is that interdependence is much greater than the politicians would agree upon or the military are happy about. Interdependence has come to such a point that it's so difficult for many nations to consider another country as a kinetic enemy. Do you think the Germans would fight the Russians as part of NATO today? What are you talking about, they would say. Hey, Deutsche Bank has 65 billion in Russia in terms of Russian debt. Do you think Germans will fight the Russians and forget about their money? No. I don't believe any major nation will fight a defensive or offensive war today. And the weapons, of course. It's no more like NATO and Warsaw Pact was. We had a circle. It was divided in the middle. You knew who were your friends and who were your enemies. It was easy. You knew the enemy targets. Is it possible today with cyber warfare, with other means of disrupting life in your country? So there is no win-win situation. There is no absolute victory in any war today. American society, I'm living in it, and it is so fragile. Something happens and the reaction is so big. 2009 economic crisis, pandemics, about 30 million people lost their jobs because it's so easy to send people away. And do you think that society will go into a war? Because the people's individual interests are far beyond control in major countries. They can export wars to distant lands, UK fighting the Argentinians in Falklands, but UK will never want to fight in Birmingham or Manchester or London. So my feeling is that state to state, big state to state, war is over. Small nations, yes, they can fight, but look at the Armenian-Azeri case. The fall war in 2020 in that area. The war never crossed the border because they were clever enough not to make it into an all-out war. They fought on the front, and when one party decided that they could not keep it up, they gave up. Okay, leadership may change. That's fine. So, simply put, my belief is that I don't expect a China to US war. Military will push for it because there's always some interest in being strong, purchasing weapons. The Turkish military and Greek military will talk about occasionally of interests, kinetic, but I have followed the timelines of Turkish-Greek conflicts. They would start late in fall, go through the winter months, but when it's tourism time, the two nations would stop all those arguments. Who would want to scare tourists coming to Aegean coasts or Greek islands?
Yeah,
it's simple. Interests.
Wow. Yeah, I love that, and I'm slightly more optimistic now when you put it that way, because what's become perhaps clear in my mind for the first time is you've basically described, what I was talking about before about the Bosnian War, that the narratives are kept alive, for the powerful to remain in power and to pursue their interests. The people are moved one way or another but never to the point of open war, but sufficiently so to build enough momentum and power and threat or fear to actually motivate people into action. And that's the first time that's a really good way of you described it, because in my mind, what I was seeing is Bosnia, but on a macro global scale between the nations like US and China and Russia, which is again is the same problem of narratives, power play dynamics. And that's a wonderful insight. And I think I'm a little bit more optimistic now, having spoken to you about that point, because we're certainly in Australia getting there's quite a lot of dust being raised about, China, US relations. Where's Australia in there? And Australia's also had some growing tensions, I guess, with China. But I think that's a really, really optimistic view, or as realistic and maybe even pessimistic it's an optimistic view for the future, which I appreciate.
Well, about 70% of Chinese labor force is involved in export items. Do you think China can afford? Okay, they have a couple of points which I found interesting. I was giving a conference in Macau and another one in Hong Kong. And in the evening, there was a reception and a couple of politicians were there. And the effects of Mau Tai, their alcoholic drink. And after some bottles, one of the politicians looked at me and said, okay, you're from NATO, right? Yes, I'm from NATO. And the US is your big boss, right? You can say that. Can you tell me what the US ships are doing in South China Sea? I stopped and he said, how do we call that sea? It's South China Sea, right? China, right? American ships, right? What happens if we send Chinese ships to San Diego Bay? How would the Americans react? Okay. he had a point, but then again, I can ask the same question. What are the Chinese ships doing in Eastern Mediterranean? Going through joint exercises with Russia about 10,000 kilometers away or more. So there will be always some rattling the sabers. It helps. But when it comes to actually throwing that saber, I think sensible nations, and I believe those major nations are sensible, will not throw that saber. That's my hope, I should say.
Yeah, that's a very optimistic note, I think, to also end on. Hasan, I'm speechless. I think we've been going for nearly 2 hours, but I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. And I'm just going to say it now: you will receive an invite for a second appearance on the podcast in the future, because I think there is so much more to talk about, and with someone like you who's lived a life of conflict in so many different dimensions. I truly thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And like I said, the time has just flown by, but I really do appreciate how much of it you've given me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I enjoyed it. And you helped me to collect my thoughts on these topics once more, because sometimes it gets too routine and I lose my maybe focus on what I'm doing. Thanks for reminding me. One last phrase. One day I was talking in private in a relaxed time with the commander. And the commander, American 4-star admiral, he said, I'm tired. I'm tired of conflicts, wars, tension. I said, be careful about what you wish. If there was complete peace on earth, you come from San Diego, you would have been a fisherman. If you were a fisherman, you wouldn't need a political advisor. And I don't know what I would be doing, maybe farming, animal husbandry. I said, so be careful about what you wish. A controlled tension, controlled crisis environment is good for people like us. And I believe almost all the military in the US or China or in Russia, they think the same way. And this goes for the politicians. So that's my last word.
Control tension. I like that a lot. That's and again, you've just opened up an entire list of questions in my head that we could where we could go from here, and we will definitely save that for the next time we speak. Thank you so much again.
With pleasure. Thank you, Maz.
Thanks for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. Just a quick reminder to complete the survey. It will take you only 2 minutes, and you can find the link in the show notes. Thank you.